We now continue with our discussion of equality, turning to discussion of equality and race. This discussion, of course, complies with the new state law in Florida governing such content in higher education, which, of course, itself raises issues and questions about this issue itself. As our reading for this, we'll look at the work of Dr. King, specifically his most famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech. So a little background for Dr. King. He was born in Atlanta on January 15th, 1929. He married Coretta Scott on June 18th, 1953, and was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. In terms of his education, in 1948, he got a bachelor's degree in sociology from Morehouse College. He applied to Yale Divinity and was rejected. In 1951, he got his Bachelor of Divinity from Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. In 1955, he earned his PhD in systematic theology from Boston University. There's been some controversy over this because it's been claimed that portions of his dissertation and academic papers were plagiarized. If you've been following current political firestorms about academics and plagiarism, this will sound familiar. Boston College, however, did not revoke his degree, so remains Dr. King. He had many accomplishments and contributions, which most people are probably aware of. He won the Nobel Prize. He was a Baptist minister, famous as a civil rights activist, and it's considered today one of the most significant American civil rights leaders. And of special importance is the fact that he's become, such a symbol that he's co-opted, sometimes people would say appropriated, by various movements, both ones that he would agree with, perhaps, and ones he would definitely disagree with. In terms of his sort of philosophical context, one of the sort of the core ideas that he developed was civil disobedience. As we'll see in the future, this seems to have been sort of first systematically developed by Henry David Thoreau, an American anarchist back in the 1800s. As we'll see, spoilers, I suppose, when Thoreau attempted it essentially as a means of protest against the Mexican-American War and against slavery, it did not succeed. And then it was later adopted famously by Gandhi in India, where it did lead to success, and then returned to the United States, where it also seems to have succeeded. But of course, there is no sort of final success or failure in history, so well worth keeping an eye on that as well. So turning now to his famous I Have a Dream speech. So the speech was delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington and delivered on August 28th, 1963. And this event has been duplicated, we really can't say duplicated, perhaps imitated is a better term, by people across the political spectrum, and going to the Lincoln Memorial, marching on Washington, etc., has become part of the American political psyche. Used by people, again, both those who would probably, agree with Dr. King and those who pretty clearly would not. So he's giving this speech in 1963, and he sets it into an historical context because it's the date 100 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, it's appropriate that he's on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial because President Lincoln, of course, was the one to sign that. Now he raises, essentially, here are the problems he's considered. Lack of freedom. He brings forth the concerns about segregation and, of course, discrimination. Now, one thing that's often left out intentionally from discussions about Dr. King is that he was also concerned about economic disparity. That is often kind of pushed aside, ignored, etc. And he notes that concerns about poverty are of great concern. That America is has vast material prosperity, but poverty is the lot of many. And so his main concerns would be lack of freedom, segregation, discrimination, and lack of material prosperity. Now, in terms of sort of good discussion focuses for this, these would clearly be, questions about, changes historically, because we can compare, of course, as he does, 1963 back to 1863, and to see what differences, what changes have arisen since during that time period relative to freedom, segregation, discrimination, and prosperity. And then, of course, we would want to look at it, looking back from our time today. Currently, as this being recorded, we're in 2024, so not quite 100 years after the speech, but quite a long time after, and we can raise questions, in terms of what has changed since 1963. So one good question would be, is there still a lack of freedom here in 2024? Is segregation still an issue in 2024? Is discrimination still an issue in 2024? And is poverty still an issue in 2024? Lack of material prosperity. And I guess, spoiler alert, the answer to all these questions does seem to be yes. Now, these, of course, are both values questions, like what counts as discrimination, what counts as segregation, what counts as freedom, what counts as, poverty, material prosperity. And then there are also factual questions. Once you have sort of the values, the concepts defined in terms of, what is segregation, what is discrimination, and the moral questions of are these, bad or not, then you have the need to address factual questions. Like in the case of segregation, if you define it a certain way, is this something as a matter of fact that still exists? Similarly, in the case of discrimination, there's a question of does this, as defined, depending on how you define it, does it exist? And similarly with, prosperity, economics, etc. So lots of important questions there. And in the course, when we're meeting in person, these are some of the things that we'll discuss. So for that class, consider those questions. Is freedom still an issue? Segregation still an issue? Discrimination still an issue? Economic concerns still an issue? So what is Dr. King, having raised these concerns, these problems, what does he present as a justification for doing something about this? Well, he uses an analogy, a metaphor, that he has come to cash a check. And here is his reasoning. Essentially, he's doing an appeal to rights, going back to our moral methods, saying that the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, are promissory notes. And you could also see this as sort of an appeal to rules, because the Constitution, Declaration of Independence lay out rules that provide rights. And of course, these documents purport to promise to all men these inalienable, self-evident rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So one could say, what is the basis for concerns, regarding, say, lack of freedom, the existence of segregation, the existence of discrimination, and economic concerns? Well, we could say it's written right into the rules, the political, social, legal rules. He asserts that this promissory note has been defaulted on when it comes to African-American citizens. It's, in his metaphor, a bad check that has come back marked insufficient funds. And his belief is that America could make good on this promissory note, and that this check should be cashed to give people the riches of freedom and the security of justice. Which leads to the obvious questions. Does the Constitution and Declaration of Independence promise that? Has America failed here? And, or if not, what has been done to address this? So, in terms of the moral argument, why America owes these things, that's his argument. Essentially that the rights are promised right in the rules. So again, going back to our moral methods, kind of an appeal to rights based on an appeal to moral rules. Now, when it comes to bringing about social change, which Dr. King proposed long ago, there are questions about when and also questions about how to bring it about. So when it comes to when, the usual answers would be typically, with obviously varying degrees. One answer, of course, is now, as soon as possible. The other answer is, of course, later, in varying degrees. Now, the idea of doing things later has a name, what it's called gradualism. The idea being that what one does is, instead of immediately make changes, one gradually makes changes. And this, of course, can lead to, the obvious discussion of what should be done. Is it better to do a gradual change? What would be the pluses and minuses there? Or is it better to do an immediate change? What would be the pluses and minuses there? And of course, there are pluses and minuses to both. Very, very quick would be, of course, the advantage of doing something quickly. If there's a problem, the usual analogy, of course, is to like a house being on fire. That was a popular analogy. And of course, you don't want to, gradually extract yourself from a burning house when it's burning. You want to, get out, and put out that fire as quickly as possible. And people argue for gradualism. They typically argue that, if you change things too quickly, there'll be pushback. Things won't actually change. But of course, the main concern about gradualism is that later could very well become never. And so, again, an important issue here is, should it be now or gradual? Dr. King is very clear about what he thinks should be done, that this should be done quickly, as immediately as possible, because this is clearly, he believes these are clearly bad problems, and this must be addressed immediately. So his answer to the question, now or later, his answer is now. Next is the question of, once you've addressed the question of when, there is the question of how. What is the methodology? Grossly oversimplifying things, it's often presented as, especially in the historical context, presented as violence versus peaceful means. And this is often presented sort of in the popular conscience, in the media, etc., even today, as sort of the peaceful view of Dr. King and the more violent proposals of Malcolm X. And that's often how it's, presented in kind of a simplified, dramatic way. So what is Dr. King's position? Well, in the I Have a Dream speech, and one, of course, should also read his later works for additional information, he advocates the, kind of the view that he's best known for and famous for, which is it should be not violent. What's his reasoning here? Well, he contends that if one is trying to bring about their rightful place, they should not do wrongful deeds. And he doesn't want to satisfy his thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. And so he argues for essentially like a moral struggle as opposed to a physical struggle. So the idea, of course, is to, but of course there'll be physical struggle involved, but as opposed to using violence. So he thinks that it should be on a high plane of dignity and discipline. Doesn't think that the protest should degenerate into physical violence. And he has the phrase, which will, if you recall back to Confucius, will echo that, which is the idea of meeting physical force with soul or moral force. So he puts forth the idea, at least in the I Have a Dream speech, that it should be peaceful. Now, this, of course, can be debated and discussed. Is what are the pluses and minuses of violent means of social change? And this will vary depending on the context and time. Like we could look back historically at the 60s, we could look at today, we could look at different countries to look at it, broadly. And similarly, like with peaceful means. So sort of a very quick outline would be the advantage of violence is people usually argue that violence can be effective. It's, if you look at, for example, the American Revolution, that was an effective use of violence. The downside of violence is, of course, is that people get hurt and killed. And as a practical matter, violence is generally only a smart or practical option when there's a reasonable chance of success through violence, or if there's no other option. In terms of peace, kind of the weakness of minus side of peace is it's easier to ignore it. The plus side, of course, again, is peaceful methods result in less death and harm, at least for the people who are subject to the peaceful protest. The people who are peaceful protesting may end up being harmed and killed themselves, as we've seen historically in the United States. Now, there's also the question about, should white people, like myself, be trusted? Can they be trusted? And King takes the answer yes. And his reasoning is based on that when he's doing, giving a speech, there are white people there, white people have, opposed racism, etc. And he thinks that there is a shared destiny, that you shouldn't distrust all white people, he claims, because, it's practical and moral matter. But that's still a reasonable question, to ask. He brings up, kind of the moral view that, you can't or shouldn't distrust all white people, despite, what some white people do. But then there's the fair question of, is that correct? Is that something true? So King's answer is straightforward. White people, can you trust them? His answer is some of them. So he thinks that what should be done is to march ahead, to, not turn back and not be satisfied until things are improved. That, he addressed very practical concerns. I mean, back in the time when Dr. King was speaking, motels and hotels were heavily segregated. There was, of course, the famous Green Book that was made into a movie, which some people think is not a particularly good movie and problematic, but the Green Book itself is an interesting matter of historical fact, essentially listing places that would be safe for travel and staying. But of course, there was severe segregation. And so, question would be today, is this still a problem? Of course, there's also the concern he raised about moving from a small ghetto to a larger one, concerns about voting, which could still come up, of course, not surprisingly today, is voting then was clearly an issue, and both in terms of not being able to vote and having nothing to vote for. And so the same issue arises today because we have things like changes to the Voters' Right Act, changes in voting regulation, etc. And some raise the criticism that many of these laws are aimed at taking away people's votes, or at the very least trying to make it more difficult. They're targeted towards minority voters to attempt to make it more difficult for them to vote and to affect elections. And so we can still raise that question today. And he thinks that one should not be satisfied until there is justice and righteousness. So again, these are all issues worth discussing today when bringing about social change, violence, or peaceful means, or perhaps varying by the context. There's also the question about what improvements have been made relative to his time, and what problems would still remain. This speech, of course, was called "I Have a Dream," and what is this dream? Well, the famous dream part of it is that the United States will finally hold to its promise, the claim that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. He also wants it to be the case that someday the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down at the table of brotherhood, and that one day even the state of Mississippi will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. And the line that is the most quoted is, of course, that his assertion, his hope that one day his children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And that's a very critical quote because, as I noted before, this is something that has been used by people across the political spectrum, and there are criticisms that in some cases it's being used by people to argue for views that Dr. King definitely would not agree with. And that's also an important point of moral discussion about misusing potentially people's quotes and questions about what he meant by that. What is it to be not judged by the color of the skin, but by the content of character? He also, of course, hoped that there'd be, in the United States, a time when in Alabama, where little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls and walk together as sisters and brothers. And that, in a very, he was a minister, so a very minister approach about how every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places shall be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. And so he's hoping for these improvements. And he thinks that this is something that could come about in his very optimistic I Have a Dream speech. And so this raises questions about how close are we, if at all, to achieving these goals. Again, questions about the appropriation of Dr. King's words and his likeness, etc., perhaps for misuse. And it's also worth considering, I focused here on his optimistic I Have a Dream speech, but it's well worth looking into his later works, which were far less optimistic. And as you might suspect, the I Have a Dream speech, as being the optimistic one, is one that's presented, as kind of the standard, but Dr. King, wrote and spoke other things. And again, it's worth looking into his works where he's rather less optimistic, especially his later works, and more critical. So that brings us to the end of this section. In the future, we'll take a look at the rights and equality involving beings that aren't human, looking at animals, plants, and also, thanks to science and technology, artificial life forms. So stay safe, and I'll see you in the future.